I probably don't go through an hour without thinking about Grenfell.
It is very hard to move on. Grenfell is always in my mind.
If they'd thought about us and they'd respected us and treated us with humanity, it didn't need to happen. So we need to find a way of restoring some humanity and respect.
The tower's burnt-out shell is covered. The country's attention has moved elsewhere. But in the aftermath of the devastating events of June 2017, the mood was very different. With anger spreading, there was even a suggestion that the aftershocks of the fire could sink the government. After a stuttering start, the then Prime Minister launched a public inquiry that's now in its second phase. She also talked of giving social housing tenants a voice.
Mr. Speaker, for too long residents have been overlooked and ignored. Will you ensure they are involved in every step of this process?
2 years ago, Theresa May's government introduced a green paper. The Prime Minister said it was the first step in delivering a new deal for social housing, and it was very much driven by what happened here at Grenfell Tower. It talked of tackling stigma and rebalancing the relationship between landlords and residents. But 2 years on, and more than 3 years after the fire that killed 72 people, many in the Grenfell community fear that reforming social housing is no longer a priority for this government. How are you feeling about it?
Very angry because, you know, I think that it feels like an act of betrayal, a betrayal of the trust that we placed in the government.
They act as if they're listened, but the action is not there. You know, you get really exhausted. It's now been 3 years, and you want to see that small change. Even the small change is not there.
Both Turafat and Edward complained repeatedly about work being done when they lived on different floors in Grenfell Tower. Edward co-wrote a blog warning something terrible would happen as a result of the refurbishment. Now, as part of Grenfell United, they're determined to protect other social housing tenants. They want a regulator with teeth, with the powers to make unannounced visits to housing associations and their like, and a way of holding landlords to account. That's what they've told the government again and again.
We've had 3 Secretary of State, 5 housing ministers. Every time we get given a new housing minister or a new Secretary of State, we have to sit down with them. We have to sit in a room and the committee goes through our individual stories, relive our own trauma, in the hope that they will understand what we went through and the importance of the need to deliver a legacy and to deliver some change. So every time we do that, at the end we've found that that's made no difference.
When Boris Johnson last week launched an overhaul of the planning system, many Grenfell survivors saw it as a kick in the teeth. The government had found time to develop a planning white paper, while the social housing white paper, the next stage in the parliamentary process, still languishes on a desk somewhere. They're also furious at the peerage given to Daniel Moylan, a former deputy leader at Kensington and Chelsea Council and former advisor to the Prime Minister.
It was Boris Johnson himself who nominated Daniel Moylan for the House of Lords, and that has definitely soured our relationships with him. Life's fine for these people, but what are we getting? Cladding, 300 buildings still covered in ACM cladding. There are apparently around 56,000 people who every evening go to bed sleeping in the same type of building as Grenfell. We want to see progress from the government. We want to see this white paper on social housing published. We want to see meaningful debate and a meaningful legacy created for Grenfell.
Have you ever met the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson?
He put a kind of half-assed invite out to meet a number of committee members. I think it's more important for Boris Johnson to actually meet the community, meet the bereaved and meet the survivors. I think for us, we want to see some action before we meet another minister, relive our trauma once again, for him to go away and do nothing.
So you've said no, you don't want to meet him at the moment?
At the moment, they've broken our trust. They need to deliver. They need to, they need to produce something for us.
The government told Newsnight when it comes to social housing, it's doing exactly that. and will deliver on a once-in-a-generation opportunity to transform tenants' lives in a white paper that's at an advanced stage. We understand their plans include what's being billed as a powerful new regulator. This former member of the Housing Select Committee echoed some of what the government told us.
It's going to be published shortly. I understand it's going to be in the autumn. It gives tenants a greater voice and it provides some regulation, a regulatory framework around social housing for the first time. So very welcome changes.
Do you believe social housing reform is a priority for this administration?
Oh, it's definitely. I mean, the government's massively increased the amount of money it's putting aside for social housing and affordable housing. Now, £12 billion, a huge increase. Key changes in terms of the aftermath of the terrible Grenfell tragedy was the reforms in terms of building regulations. It was a complete ban on combustible materials on the outside of tall buildings. That's already been put in place, a complete ban on combustible materials, and the government's put in place £1.6 billion of funding to remediate buildings that already have combustible cladding on them.
Too late, of course, for Grenfell's residents. Edward's complaints in the years before the fire included that tenants had had no opportunity to comment on the cladding being put on their building.
That was why we wrote the blog, because it was quite obvious that with a non-functioning organisation that was being refused to be scrutinised, the only outcome was that something terrible was going to happen, and it was only when something terrible happened that that scrutiny could occur.
Even now, they say, Grenfell hasn't been a watershed for landlords. Social housing tenants still don't have a voice.
They pretend as if they changed the attitude, especially after Grenfell happened. But from where I'm living now, is the attitude is the same as the landlord at Grenfell. You complain, but you never get any answer back.
If change is coming, it can't come soon enough. But will what the government announces be sufficient to regain the trust of the Grenfell community?